Hello and welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today I'm going to be covering the final gold medal match for the Dutch Lion Cup 2024, which happened just about a month ago. It happened between Maarten and Ondřej here, and no, I'm not going to try their last names. You're just going to have to read the title for that. However, there's a little bit of confusion. The header at the top says that Maarten is on the left and Ondřej's on the right. Actually, they are switched. You can even tell by the armbands. But for the most part, the reason I wanted to cover this fight is because there was an interesting matchup here in terms of not only aggressive versus defensive fencing, but also an adaptation for the shorter fencer trying to make things work against a taller fencer. And that's a situation that I know comes up a lot for everyday people, and one where you can learn quite a lot from these particular fights. So for our first exchange, we have the feeling out period, where both fencers will kind of dance in and out of range and test each other's defenses to see what will or will not work in the future. However, both fencers come forward with a right leg forward stance. And while that's pretty typical, it is important to pay attention to because, in my opinion, a right leg forward stance is a more aggressive stance. It puts your dominant side forward along with your dominant hand, and it shortens the distance between your weapon and your opponent. But when both people come forward with a right leg forward and are right hand dominant, well, you can see how that distance gets even shorter. And in this particular case, what we see is both fencers come forward with a pretty committed offense, and both of them land, resulting in a double. And normally this would be the kind of exchange that I would skip, but it's very important because not only was this the first exchange resulting in a double, but this is the first exchange from which both of these fencers are now going to try to adapt. So for our second exchange, we see our first adaptation. And although both fencers do and continue to come out with their right leg forward, you can see a pretty noted difference in their footwork and their distance management. No longer are both of them moving so quickly in and out of range at the exact same time, resulting in the double that we saw previously. And instead, they're staying a lot more static and trying to use their bounces to go further backwards rather than forwards in order to try to prevent that from happening again. Though, in my opinion, the first adaptation that is successful here comes from Ondřej on the left. Remember, the ticker's reversed. And his adaptation is one where he attempts to use his height and his heightened position at his shoulder level to try to get in a more credible defense to his shorter opponent. In this particular case, the fencer on the right, Maarten, comes in, tries to throw what I would consider a kind of stepping parry, a kind where he lunges into measure and throws a cron parry straight up to the level of his head. However, because Ondřej on the left here is taller, he is able to throw a zwerk over the top of even that stepping parry and land a shot to the head. Because Maarten came forward with a defensive action, he was not able to throw a riposte in measure and in time and was not given the points. But the adaptation here is critical because what we're going to see from now on is Ondřej on the left continue to try to use his height to his advantage and try to continue to get these sneaky shots in over the top. For our next exchange, we see Ondřej do exactly what I described he was going to attempt to do and continue to threaten that left zwerk over the top towards Maarten's head. However, Maarten makes the next adaptation and realizes that every single time he comes forward into measure, Ondřej takes a step back and attempts to throw that left zwerk to a high priority target, at which point his adaptation, of course, is to step into measure, not really throw anything at all, trigger the response from Ondřej, and then snipe him in the hands. And this is the adaptation that gets Maarten a whole lot of points going forward. But it's not just a really smart adaptation in general to this kind of fencing, but it's a particularly smart adaptation that takes advantage of the fact that Maarten is the shorter fencer here. You see, 9 times out of 10, when someone is taller, they're going to fence at the level of their shoulders and go for deep targets because their shoulder is probably more in line with your head. However, there is a disadvantage, and that is every time you fence at the level of your shoulders, you are presenting your hands forward in order to keep that dominant high line. And the problem with presenting your hands forward is that they are snipeable. They're not just snipeable from the perspective of someone who is of equal height to you, though. They are also significantly more snipeable from someone who is shorter than you. Because if they can trick you into overcommitting and maybe getting a parry, they can throw their middle cuts at the level of where your hands are going to be, rather than where your hands currently are, and get that meaty section of forearm that often gets exposed whenever you try to pull your hands back from a shot that you have just thrown into your more defensive posture. This allows shorter fencers to be, in my opinion, much more prolific hand snipers as long as they can defend themselves from the first high line cut that their opponent is showing. For our next exchange, we see an adaptation from Ondřej here, but one that is a little bit unsuccessful. And in my opinion, it's unsuccessful because he has misattributed the hand snipe that he received in the previous exchange to the fact that he was being defensive. And that's not an unreasonable thought to have. Generally, when someone gets hit in the hands, it is because they were being defensive and they were not simply throwing some kind of committed strike out, because 9 times out of 10, when someone throws something at a low priority target, you also have openings to hit them in a high priority target. Though this was not the case, and we can see why from this exchange. Ondřej comes in with a very threatening and very explosive attack towards the head of Maarten, but he doesn't make it far enough. And the reason he doesn't make it far enough is because he has an expectation right up till now that Maarten will continually use his footwork to move into range with a defensive action, as we saw in the second exchange. However, that is not what Maarten does. He bounces well out of range, throws a parry, and then a follow-up cut across the middle. And the reason he throws that cut across the middle is because Ondřej, as the taller fencer, is not able to get his guard meaningfully down to that level to parry. At the exact same time, because he is already out of distance, he is unable to continue his passing steps forward because he has his right leg forward. As I said at the beginning, this right leg was going to come into play, and this is one of the ways it does. When you fight with your right leg forward and you are right hand dominant and you throw a lunge in order to get into measure, it is very difficult for you to take a follow-up passing step to continue your forward momentum. What that means is that a lot of people, if they use the proper footwork, can use all of your lunging techniques as a method of coaxing out an overextension from you and throw a follow-up attack. Because once you land into your deep lunge position, you will really have nowhere to go but straight back up into a recovery or backwards into a defensive posture. And in both cases, being able to throw a middle hell across to the belly is a great counter to both of those options. So for our next exchange, we see another great demonstration of why the shorter fencer can have the advantage in these particular kinds of situations. And in this case, we see again the right leg forward footwork from Ondřej sort of start to fail him. He comes forward with a lunge into measure, but does not get the response that he wants from Maarten, and so throws another one with a nice left sverk straight over the top towards Maarten's head, which misses. It doesn't miss because it was wrongly placed. It doesn't miss because he, raised or lowered his arms from the level of his shoulder inappropriately. He missed because Maarten looks to be about 2 or 3 or 4 inches shorter, and as a result, when he did the old lean back and threw up his cron parry, his head was now 4 or 5 or 6 inches lower than it was maybe supposed to be, and as a result, Ondřej's left sverk over the top completely misses. At the exact same time, Maarten throws a cut to the hands, which lands completely undefended. Now, if Maarten was much taller, this kind of hand strike probably would have resulted in him getting hit in the head and getting the worst end of a bad double differential. But in this case, it works because Maarten is using, again, the footwork that we talked about before, where every single time Ondřej comes forward, he moves backwards and now maybe even a little bit off to the side in order to get those advantageous angles and snipe at those hands, and at the same time, use the fact that Ondřej has to completely recalibrate where he throws all of his deep target strikes to get a couple misses and then the advantage of a couple of exchanges. Now, for our next exchange, it is Ondřej's turn to counter-adapt, and he is going to do something very intelligent that takes advantage, once again, of his height and his length. Now, in these particular exchanges, what has been happening is that Maarten has been moving out of range and just sniping at the hands, and Ondřej's strikes have not been landing where he wants them to. So, what does he change? He changes the level that he fences at. He goes into a slightly deeper stance, which lowers the level of his shoulders, and he starts throwing attacks from his plow positions, the positions where his hands are more in line with his hips. And what this allows him to do is throw shots straight forward, just as he normally would, and as he does in this exchange with a thrust, but he is able to pull out of them in time even though Maarten moves backwards. The reason for this is when you throw a big explosive thrust forward, your hands are going to get exposed based on how high they are in relation to your opponent's hands. Because he has lowered his level, he is no longer exposing his hands quite as much, and when Maarten tries to throw that hand strike, all he really gets is a bunch of blade and crossguard, at which point Ondřej is the one who goes up into the cron parry and gets the better of the breakaway. Now, the breakaway is a term I use for when two people enter into a hard bind where generally the strongs of their blades are touching, but then they decide that they're not going to continue forward and they're going to instead move away from each other. And in this separation, there is always an opportunity to get a cheeky little strike off. But those cheeky little breakaway shots always benefit the larger, the longer, and the taller fencer because their arms are more likely able to reach the target level of your opponent's shoulders while still being able to move backwards. And that's exactly what happens here. After Ondřej goes up into his cron parry, after they have their little breakaway separation, Ondřej is able to throw a right side cut all the way to the side that despite the fact that Maarten was almost able to parry, he wasn't quite able to get there in time because he had just come from a position where his arms were straight up in the air. Ondřej, being taller, only had to have his arms at the level of his shoulders and then was able to throw that cut with a minimal amount of vertical travel. Now, this next exchange is not very visually appealing. It's technically kind of a double, but it is another important thing to consider if you ever want to try to use this kind of defensive-oriented footwork that we see coming from Maarten. And that is, one of the advantages that I haven't talked about the right leg forward stance is that it allows you to throw your attack very quickly and on a moment's notice. And what you often are looking for when you have that right leg forward stance is you want to see your opponent move into range and then stand there and not do anything. And the reason you want that as your trigger is because if you can guess the exact moment that your opponent is moving into range but not doing something, that is the absolute perfect time for you to do something and move even deeper into range than you think is necessary. And that's pretty much what we see here. Maarten comes forward and gestures with his footwork that he's going to move into range but doesn't attack. And at the exact moment that this happens, Ondřej counters with a very large, very committed shot right over the top. At the exact same time as this happens, Maarten realizes that he is currently in the process of moving backwards and hasn't couched any kind of counterattack of his own. So instead, he throws a middle how to the ribs and simply leaves it at that, trying to move his hands up as high as he can to defend himself from the shot that honestly had already landed. In a lot of positions, a lot of people would call this a double, but in my opinion, this is a really intelligent way to at least try to double, because 9 times out of 10, your opponent is not going to be able to put up a credible enough defense or offense in this position, and unlike Maarten, is not going to be able to land that middle cut without being able to simultaneously get your hands up into a position where they might even credibly try to defend you. What happens far more often than not is that Maarten in this position would have simply moved backwards, tried to parry that cut over the top of the head, and not been able to get there in time. It was only his extreme awareness of where he was that he was able to throw that cut to the body and try to defend himself in the afterblow, making it look a little bit less messy. But at the end of the day, it was a situation where Ondřej took full advantage of the fact that Maarten has to be very, very careful about when he explosively moves his feet forward, because not only as the shorter fencer does he not quite have the exact same distance, but he has to make sure that every single time he does move forward, he throws up a kind of credible offense. If he doesn't, Ondřej has couched right there the perfect response to that, and that's exactly what we saw happen here. Now, many people will accuse right leg forward fencers of doing so in a rather Olympic fencing style, and they're not 100% wrong. And one aspect in which they are 100% right is with this adaptation we see from Ondřej, utilizing the fleche, or the arrow, or however the fuck you're supposed to pronounce that. The basic idea of this principle is that when you have your right leg forward, it's very hard to follow up, right? Well, one of the ways that you can follow up anyway is to simply fully commit yourself to a thrust and walk or run with both of your legs forward until either you hit your target, or you run past your target, or you hit the opposing wall of the gym. The idea with this is that by fully committing with both feet forward, you take away the limitation that the lunge has of forcing you to have a limit to your forward commitment. By continuing to move forward, what you essentially ensure is that if your opponent is being extremely defensive and doing what Maarten has been doing, dancing out of range, waiting for you to overcommit, and then trying to counterattack, you are able to miss with the initial part of your thrust, but then continue and drive it forward so that as they attempt to simply throw a counterattack rather than a parry riposte, your fleche attack, your straight arrow lunge is still going to land somewhere, and then you're going to get the advantage. Now, in Olympic fencing, that advantage comes in the form of right of way, but we don't have that here. What we instead here have is the advantage that the arrow attack has for forcing your opponent to either choose between parrying or doubling. And in a lot of ways, the intelligent option, in my opinion, is often to try to double and move your body offline, because fleches from most people aren't actually all that accurate with their point. But in this particular case, what we see is Maarten attempt to parry after he was immediately going to try to go for a hand snipe and fail to get that parry off just far enough so that it buries itself in his arm as Ondřej runs past. It is also important to note that even though this thrust did land to the arm, Maarten was still in a far superior position to parry and then riposte, and if we want to go into the stupid world of martial validity, it's 100% accurate to think that regardless of whether or not your thrust would somehow instantly kill somebody, it's very, very likely that you would still be able to throw some kind of afterblow, and committing to a thrust in this way is one in which you forego all defensive options both during and after your thrust. So, it is an option that has to be used in only the most dire of situations. Ondřej, in my opinion, did use this technique appropriately. He used it in the right situation. He used it to try to capitalize on the fact that Maarten was continually jumping out of his range and using his overcommitments to land hand shots. So, committing with a thrust does make sense. However, I would say that it would probably work a lot better if Ondřej had simply switched his feet, thrown a thrust with his left leg forward, driving forward with his right leg, and then he would have found himself in a very happy and comfortable position with his right leg forward after that thrust had failed to land because Maarten had jumped backwards, and he would have been able to continue the exchange from a much more defensive-oriented position. So we come now to the final exchange, and we have our final affirmation of what I would consider, again, the footwork problem with right leg forward fencing. And it's very clear that Ondřej is becoming aware of this problem, because in this particular exchange, he comes forward with a little bit of a feinted hand shot. Maarten jumps out of range, as he's done all these times before. And Ondřej tries to follow up this attack with a step forward with his left leg and another left zwerk. And he once again gets sniped in the hands. And the reason this happens is because despite the fact that he tries desperately to follow up his lunge with a step with his left leg, the lunge position is simply too deep and too committed for him to get his left leg into presence. And instead of taking a step forward with his left leg, he instead takes a step to the side. This step is disastrous in this particular exchange because stepping to the side does not get you any closer to your target. Not only that, Ondřej was throwing a rather short-ish range strike, the left zwerkow. Despite the fact that the left zwerkow is with closed hands, you can still get it pretty far out there, but it's always going to be that crucial inch or two shorter than a regular Oberhau. So, in combination with offline footwork and a left zwerkow, the distance was so heavily shortened that Maarten's backward footwork was able to get him into a position where he could simply snipe the arm and be well out of measure for the follow-up strike that Ondřej intended to throw. Again, the result being that when you lunge so deeply with your right leg forward, you're going to be in this situation all the time where these follow-ups are not going to be able to close the distance accurately. And instead, it probably would have worked out better if Ondřej had used the fleche technique that he used in the previous exchange. But that's neither here or there. Maarten ends up winning the fight, and I believe the entire competition overall. And he does so using some very, very nice footwork and some very, very nice distance and timing management. But if you'd like to see more breakdowns like this, I will be coming out with another one on Thursday.